So, welcome everyone to this meeting of the C.S. Lewis Society. It's very wonderful to see all you here, some old faces, some new faces, very excited for today. Let me start with some brief introductions and an apology. As you can see, it's quite dark. I've just come back from America, so I'm back here. It's dark again now, and the lighting in this room doesn't dispose itself to Zoom, so do forgive me for that. I've got a small candle here, but it's not giving off much light. There you go. Let me just start by introducing our officers just before we begin. Our senior member, who is not with us today, is Alistair McGrath. Our senior advisor, Dr. Michael Ward, thank you. I'm your president, Daniel. Our secretary is Grace Oliver, and our treasurer is Lauren Spon. So thank you very much, everyone, for being with us today. I'm very excited today to be introducing Andrew Laszlo to you. Now, for those of you that don't know Andrew, Andrew is a world-renowned speaker and author on C.S. Lewis. He's taught literature for many years, 10 years, I think you were saying earlier, Andrew, 10 years at school. So he's well used to cajoling a rowdy bunch. So we'll all be on our best behavior today. He's spoken in the US and the UK. He published in 2009, Mere Christians, Encounters, can't speak, with C.S. Lewis. And he also published C.S. Lewis, The Early Prose of Joy, which was Lewis's very first spiritual autobiography. He's currently at the Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, in Virginia, where he's preparing for the Episcopal priesthood. He's taken holy orders, and he's pursuing romantic theology at the same time at Northwind Seminary. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce to you Andrew Laszlo. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and it's a great joy to be amongst you. I want to begin by thanking you for the kind invitation, and also thanking you for the memorial service for Walter Hooper, which was very touching. It was wonderful to parachute in. I've long wished to attend the society, but unfortunately have never been over during term time, and so maybe we can rectify that at some point in the future. I wanted to speak to you tonight about Sehnsucht as Signpost, the autobiographical impulse of C.S. Lewis. And I want to frame this talk around an understandable error, a helpful conversation, and an invaluable insight. And I'll begin with the error. In his essay, Until We Have Faces, in the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, Peter Skokel reasonably claims that nearly all of Lewis's other stories, apart from Till We Have Faces, are third-person accounts, with the narrator providing a reliable point of view to orient the reader. And while that statement is understandable, I'm going to suggest that it's altogether wrong, or almost altogether wrong. I'll begin by looking at Lewis's other stories, and I'll take these in chronological order in order to prove my point. Third-person accounts, I thought so too, until I began my research on Till We Have Faces 15 years ago. Boxen begins, the very first line, "It is not my aim in writing this book." A few years later, several years later, Dimer begins, "I first took my pen to write with all my road before me," famously. Pilgrim's Regress, not long afterwards, begins the very first line, "I dreamed of a boy." Out of the Silent Planet as well contains a first-person narrator. In chapter 22, narrator Lewis says, "If I were guided by purely literary conventions, I would find that it's time to remove my mask. And Ransom is not his real name," which is a puzzlement because Meheladil's name is Ransom too, but there it is. In the postscript to Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom is writing to Lewis and says, "I think you are right." So certainly a first-person narrator here. And you'll also notice that some of these are not altogether reliable, or at least fictional. In The Dark Tower, tentatively dated 1939, it begins, "There were 4 of us in Orfeo's study." The Screwtape Letters, of course, begins, "I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands." And then the narrator, Lewis, asserts in a since deleted paragraph that Dr. Ransom translated the Screwtape Letters from Old Solar. So a first-person narrator and maybe somebody leaning a little bit more towards a creative outlook. The very first line of Paralandra, "As I left the railway station," and of course, not many chapters in, we get the long passage translated from the Latin of Notvilsius. And of course, Notvilsius, as has been pointed out by my betters, is the Latin for Notwilk, which of course was Lewis's pen name, the NW of NW Clerk. The Great Divorce begins, the opening line, "I seemed to be standing in a busy queue by the side of a long, mean street." And it ends, "I awoke in a cold room, the sirens howling overhead." Throughout the Chronicles of Narnia, you have a number of narrative asides that speak to the reader as you, thus assuming certainly a first-person narrator. Just one example will suffice. In Prince Caspian, looking at the wallet that Caspian is about to take as he goes into the woods, the narrator says, "It's like a satchel you would use for taking books to school." But perhaps most convincingly, a first-person narrator makes a poignant and pointed appearance in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Lucy is describing the end of the journey of the Dawn Treader and describing the beauties that she saw there. Lucy could only say, "It would break your heart." "Why?" said I. "Was it so sad?" "Sad? No," said Lucy. This is the only time a narrator speaks to one of the children, and as I've explored in some of my other works, it's perhaps no coincidence that it is Lucy to whom he speaks. So I find Skakel unconvincing that Lewis's other stories use a third-person narrator. It often morphs into a third-person narrator, but there's almost always a definite presence of Lewis himself or a narrative pseudo-Lewis speaking in these stories. Forgive me. So I find Lewis almost endlessly self-referential in these stories, and indeed elsewhere, much of his scholarly works is filled with his own references and his own personal assertions. He often positions himself, therefore, as a fictional, if not quite untrustworthy narrator. Nevertheless, Skakel does us a real favor by wisely asserting us to the questionable narrator in Till We Have Faces. I suggest that Orwell, in some ways, culminates a career of these self-referential narrators with a, shall we say, creative relationship to the facts. The opening line is, "I am old now and have not much to fear from the anger of gods." But if you trace her claim throughout the book, you find that she actually fears the gods almost all the way through. I've explored online and elsewhere many times where Orwell is consciously lying, perhaps the most significant of which is the beginning of book 2, where she says, "I should unroll my scroll and start all over again. To leave it thus would be to die perjured." So here we have this unreliable narrator. Interestingly, though, enough, the truth kind of squeezes out in Orwell's account. And if you pay careful attention, what you'll find as you read her narrative is that she often contains verifiable and true factual information in her parenthetical statements. She is, especially in book one, consciously deceiving both herself and her readers. But the truth will out, and you'll find if you watch the parentheses that she actually is speaking the truth. And so, what you have in Lewis's fictional settings are really truthful accounts that are not necessarily altogether truthful. Working on Till We Have Faces for 15 years now have revealed to me a number of kind of keys or principles that I think reveal the veil over that maddening and marvelous novel. What that novel has to do with autobiography, I shall soon explain. If you want to learn all of these keys or principles, I'm afraid that you will have to invite me back, perhaps preferably in term time, once the pubs have opened again. But most to our purposes, I've discovered that virtually everything that Lewis wrote, and this is one of my keys to understanding Till We Have Faces, virtually everything Lewis wrote, both before and after Till We Have Faces, is discernibly present in that book. Spurred by Owen Barfield's claim that what Lewis thought about everything was secretly present in what he said about anything, I began rooting around, wondering if Till We Have Faces not only has a self-referential and questionable narrator, of course it does, but if in fact it may offer us a specimen, perhaps the best specimen of Lewis's autobiography. My first kind of revelation that Till We Have Faces was shot through with Lewis's other writings came from this dishonest narrator. And when I realized that Orwell was perjuring herself, and that in order to get wise spiritual counsel and accurate philosophical statements, one has to take Orwell's upside down statements and chiasmically turn them right side up, which reminded me very much indeed of that maddening book, The Screwtape Letters. Once I understood that Orwell was likely Screwtape, I began to see that maybe Till We Have Faces is not only Screwtape Letters, but many other things as well. And in fact, you hear echoes of just about everything that Lewis has written throughout the pages of the book. One need only compare the cry of Pam in The Great Divorce. The boy was mine, mine, mine. And you will hear the same echo of Orwell claiming of Psyche in book 2. Mine, mine, she was mine. Don't you gods know what mine means? Echoes everywhere. But perhaps most importantly for our hour today, it's maybe important to consider Till We Have Faces as a kind of autobiography. And in order to shore up that claim, let me talk about the other of Lewis's published autobiographies. We certainly acknowledge, and up until quite recently acknowledged as Lewis's first autobiography, The Pilgrim's Regress, about which David C. Downing observantly asserts that Lewis seemed almost to be writing for an audience of one, himself. So this combination of autobiography and self-referentiality shows up there. But this actually wasn't the first time that Lewis wrote an autobiography. In October of 1932, Lewis wrote to Owen Barfield that The Pilgrim's Regress spurted out so suddenly after, quote, the long preparation by failure in the prose it and the autobiographical poem. Let me take a moment to talk about both of those, the prose it and the autobiographical poem. The prose it clearly refers to what Walter Hooper later titled early prose joy. I discovered this by good fortune in the archives of the Wade Center. I was sitting close enough to the archivist desks that I could eavesdrop on the conversation because I am a man of eminently bad manners. And when they were discussing a folder that contained what was then labeled as an early autobiographical fragment of Surprised by Joy, Laura Schmidt and Heidi Trudy were discussing what that might be. And I asked if I could see. Well, at the very beginning, early prose joy has fragments of Milton's currant bush and the descriptions of Milton, the toy garden that Warney has. These are all in the first few chapters of early prose joy. But at the very end, you find a clear reference to Pilgrim's Regress with the Augustinian phrase "securus te proique," securely throw yourself in. This reference to Mother Kirk speaking to the pilgrim at the end of Pilgrim's Regress. So it begins with Surprised by Joy and it ends with Pilgrim's Regress. And I pushed my other work aside and spent the rest of the week transcribing the essay for the first time. And what I found was this first autobiographical scrap. So I transcribed it, edited it, published it in 2013. But throughout, Lewis never refers to the phrase joy. He never refers to joy as such. In fact, prose it is how he refers to the experience of Sehnsucht or longing. Sehnsucht was it. It, incidentally, is a word to conjure with because it has several meanings in Lewis's writings. And one of the things that it refers to is Lewis himself. It also refers to some things that have been crossed out of Lewis's letters to Arthur. And I believe those all tie together, but that's a talk for a different day. So in the spring of 1932 is Pilgrim's Regress, but it's preceded by the early prose it. Charlie Starr, I've just been in communication with him today. We have with absolute certainty dated that manuscript as of early prose joy, early prose it, as written after July of 1930, but absolutely definitely before October of 1931. So this is significantly before Lewis's subsequent autobiographical attempts in 1932. So it makes early prose joy Lewis's very first formal autobiography. In his critical edition of the collected poems of C.S. Lewis, Don W. King has published the surviving 34 lines of the quote-unquote autobiographical poem. These lines begin, "I will write down the portion that I understand." Those lines are from a 1932 letter to Barfield. And it contains this very telling comment about this verse attempt at autobiography. Lewis says, "I am not satisfied with any part I have yet written, and the design is ludicrously ambitious. But I feel it will be several years anyway before I give it up." And I believe that this is key. And of course, several years later, we have Surprised by Joy, which, according to Paul F. Ford, was written between 1948 and 1953, overlapping, incidentally, the years which Lewis composed during which Lewis composed the Narnia books, and of course, finally published in 1955. Importantly, we find in its preface another instance of Lewis's first person and unreliable narrator. He claims in that preface to Surprised by Joy, "The story is, I fear, suffocatingly subjective, the kind of thing I have never written before and shall probably never write again." Balderdash. As we have seen, Lewis absolutely has written this kind of thing before. In fact, in places, Lewis either quotes exactly or closely rewrites early prose joy in Surprised by Joy. So much so that I have to imagine he had that notebook open before him when he wrote that shape of his early life. Of course, this is no surprise. Lewis advises a correspondent years later, never throw anything away, stick it in a drawer. You never know when it will serve. And certainly early prose joy served him, and he copied out phrases from that. I don't know why he claims never to have written that Surprised by Joy was the kind of thing I have never written before. He's written it all the time. But I also suggest that we expand Lewis's autobiographical arc beyond early prose joy, I Will Write Down, The Pilgrim's Regress, and Surprised by Joy. I suggest that we also include Till We Have Faces, which Lewis calls far and away my best book, and in another place, much my best book. In it, he does something extremely interesting that may help us shift our understanding of Lewis's most central tasks. I'll suggest that this novel, Till We Have Faces, represents Lewis's best specimen of this thing that he struggled to do all of his life, his task of describing his quest for joy. He seems to have been at it all the time, and I think that he finally gets as close as he can Till We Have Faces, and I think that there are certain definable reasons why he stops. So I'll suggest that we expand the autobiographical arc. And having disputed Skakel, I'll now mention that very helpful conversation which aided me in this thinking. I was privileged to have lunch with Dr. McGrath, Professor McGrath, in the spring of 1923, before I published Early Prose Joy and before he published The Intellectual World of C.S. Lewis. At the Linear Theological Library there in Houston, we sat together and talked about autobiography, and we mused about whether, in addition to Early Prose Joy, I Will Write Down, Pilgrim's Regress, and Surprised by Joy, we may, in some sense, see Lewis's autobiographical urge, almost compulsion even, extending to some of Lewis's more creative books. So let me make the case for that. On the heels of that conversation later that year, in my introductory essay to Early Prose Joy, I suggested that perhaps we might profitably consider Dimer, A Grief Observed, and Till We Have Faces, and others of Lewis's works as specimens of spiritual autobiography, instances of Lewis again and again trying to tell the central story of how God worked in his life. In 2014's Intellectual World of C.S. Lewis, McGrath also suggests including A Grief Observed amongst the autobiographies. And so if we do indeed take Barfield at his word that what Lewis thought about everything was secretly present in what he said about anything, we may find it productive to think about Lewis's impulse to tell the story of his search for Sehnsucht, stretching throughout his authorial life. Let me make that case. We can extend this quest for joy and despairing of grabbing it and joy sparked by beauty. We can see it certainly as early as 1919 in Spirits in Bondage. In Dungeon Greats, Lewis sounds a familiar theme of seeking these stabs of joy, unrepeatable and spurred by beauty. Here's what he says in that poem. But only the strange power of unsought beauty in some casual hour can build a bridge of light or sound or form to lead you out of all this strife and storm. When of some beauty we are grown apart, till from its very glory's midmost heart out leaps a sudden beam of larger light into our souls. I'll suggest that although the poems of Spirits in Bondage are filled with quite pessimistic post-war thoughts by Lewis, he famously says, "Our throats can bark for slaughter, cannot sing," in Monchy-le-Preux. Still, this idea of beauty sparking joy that invades us and then skips away certainly appears. We find another autobiographical fragment of the fleeting Sehnsucht appearing in the 1924 poem Joy. Here he says, "Rapture will not stay longer than this, lest mortals grow divine and old laws change too much. The sensitive ray of beauty, her creative vision fine, pass. I am hers, but she will not again be mine. So here it is again, not surprisingly, in a poem called Joy. We could profitably spend the whole hour exploring how the quest for joy also pervades the telling of Daimer. And in the just published Hansen lectures accompanying the annotated Daimer in a volume called Splendor in the Dark by Jerry Root, the Hansen lectures by Jerry Root, the annotations by David Downing. Jerry notes that by the time Lewis wrote Daimer, the longings were again finding quarter in his mind. Longing for joy, pursuing joy, finding it and having it and not having. So that's Daimer, published in the late 20s. Also Until We Have Faces, another book Lewis wrote and rewrote throughout his life from his teen years on. We find perhaps the most poignant and developed account of the search for joy. Recall what Psyche said about the Gray Mountain. Here are her words. Do you remember the color and the smell and looking across at the Gray Mountain in the distance? And because it was so beautiful, it set me to longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, Psyche, come. But I couldn't, not yet, come. And I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind are flying home. The sweetest thing in all my life has been the longing to reach the mountain, to find the place where all the beauty came from. Do you think it all meant nothing? All the longing for home? For indeed, it now feels not like going, but like going back. Here is this quest for joy, this longing tied to beauty and inaccessibility. And Psyche is not the only one who experiences it. Even out of the depths of despair, not dissimilar to the setting of Spirits in Bondage, Orwell trudging up the hill to go bury Psyche and lead a bleak and empty life afterwards, hears the voice calling to her, inviting her, saying, why should your heart not dance? There's nothing, let me suggest, in Orwell's psyche, in Orwell's mind, that would lead her to this invitation of joy. She immediately lists a myriad of reasons why she should not allow her heart to dance. An invitation, incidentally, repeated by Psyche not long afterwards. But Orwell, in the midst of her self-deception, fails to see the importance of joy, much as Screwtape fails to see the most essential things too. And the import of this question is not only what it asks her to do, but who is speaking. She is on the holy mountain. I suggest that it perhaps is the God of the mountain that speaks to her. Why should your heart not dance? It's a story, as she describes, when she sees the beautiful world around her. It's a story about beauty and joy that would thrill and then fly away. If we take Alistair at his suggestion and include A Grief Observed as autobiographical, and I don't think that's much of a leap, then we now find this autobiographical arc extending throughout Lewis's entire life, both as an adult and as a writer. In 1919, Spirits in Bondage. 1924, Joy. In the 1920s, late 1920s, Daimer, although he'd been working at it for years. 1930, Early Prose Joy. 1932, I Will Write Down. 1932, Pilgrim's Regress. 1948 to 1953, Surprised by Joy. 1955, Till We Have Faces. And 1960, A Grief Observed. It doesn't surprise those of us who know how coherent Lewis's mind is, and it makes sense of what Barfield has suggested, that Lewis is developing a theme through many different works through all of his life. Excuse me. So if I have suggested to some degree that there is this autobiographical arc, let me ask this question. Why does Lewis refer to himself so often in his fiction? And a related question, why does he continue to write and rewrite his autobiography of the search for Sehnsucht? I suggest that the answer arises from that valuable insight that I mentioned, which comes from our own senior advisor. Father Ward convincingly makes the case for Lewis's secretiveness, even his willingness to, quote, be economical with the actualité. One sees this secrecy not only in Lewis's narrative pseudo-selves, but also in his omissions, as Ward points out. His omissions from Surprised by Joy, which led Humphrey Havard to call that book Suppressed by Jack, and led George Sayer to claim that Jack never ceased to be secretive. I agree with Ward. I think that Lewis's profound, vigilantly maintained, extraordinary secrecy in some ways perhaps overcorrects itself in Lewis's pervasive self-referentiality and his autobiographical impulse as he tells the story of fleeting joy, what he calls elsewhere, building the temple, though the god has flown. He keeps too quiet, but the story will out, and so it makes its appearance. It's almost like squeezing a balloon in the air, popping up elsewhere. But controversially, let me suggest that I don't believe that joy, stabs of longing, Sehnsucht, I don't believe that that is what Lewis was really about. I find myself entirely unconvinced that Lewis was really trying to tell the story of joy after all. In fact, I'll be bold enough to claim that if we think primarily of joy when discussing Lewis, we come dangerously close to missing the actual and central point of what Lewis's life and work were in fact about. It's an audacious claim, perhaps, especially in such an august gathering. But ultimately, I don't believe that Lewis gave a fiddler's fig about joy. Inspired, admittedly, by Father Ward's brilliant word on the hidden underpinnings of Narnia, I turned to the Till We Have Faces to ask if maybe a similar structure undergirds Lewis's best book. And I believe definitively that I have found it. But I make this assertion based on an almost incontrovertible authority on Lewis himself, of course. So let me ask you to consider very carefully the closing pages of Lewis's last formal autobiography, and I suggest his last full treatment of joy, for I find Till We Have Faces and A Grief Observed concerned with something else entirely. Listen to how Lewis concludes Surprised by Joy. This is from the last page. But what, in conclusion, of joy? For that, after all, is what the story has mainly been about. To tell you the truth, the subject has lost nearly all interest for me since I became a Christian. I believe, if the thing were at all worth recording, that the old stab, the old bittersweet, has come to me as often and as sharply since my conversion as at any time of my life whatever. But I now know that the experience, considered as a state of my own mind, had never the kind of importance I once gave it. It was valuable only as a pointer to something other and outer. If we are to take Lewis at his word here, and I suggest that we do, it, joy, longing, Sehnsucht, served only as a signpost pointing to something other and outer. Remember on the same page the pillars of silver and lettering of gold pointing the travelers to Jerusalem? So what is that other and outer? What could possibly mean more to Lewis than joy? To what did all of the longings point? To what enormous lack did Sehnsucht indicate? To answer this, let us turn to the transcript of the talks for the Four Loves, which comes from 1958. It's actually, in some ways, the first draft of that later book. In those talks, Lewis describes love in this way. Love is how we go out of ourselves towards others. I believe that what Lewis was searching for and trying to describe all of his life was not Sehnsucht, but what Sehnsucht pointed to, something other and outer, love. That, I believe, is what Lewis truly sought. In fact, I propose that love is the overarching, underlying theme of everything Lewis wrote and did. And again, this puts us right at the very heart of Till We Have Faces. Following Professor Ward's, Dr. Ward's discovery, I thought about whether or not there may be an underlying structure to Till We Have Faces. And maybe if it's not a tautology, I found it. I'm convinced that every line of that novel is about love. And that hidden structure is in the second sentence of the book itself. I have no husband, Eros, nor child, Storge, nor hardly a friend, Philia, through whom the gods can hurt me, the opposite of agape. I think the structure of Till We Have Faces is the structure of the Four Loves, and I think that it's love that ultimately Joy was pointing to. Orwell's struggle against the gods is the very struggle we see throughout Lewis's autobiographies. Like Lewis, Orwell has to admit the existence of an other, of an outer, and must turn from her great sin of pride. Early prose Joy chronicles how difficult this was for Lewis to admit that his solipsism was in fact vacuous and pointless. And just like Lewis in the very last pages of the book, Orwell too prays and admits that God was God and is also almost the most dejected and reluctant of converts. This is also why we see her struggles with joy. Why should she struggles with joy? Why should your heart not dance? And we see that those struggles end halfway through the book, because Lewis is no longer writing about joy. He's writing about the real struggle, the struggle with which Lewis grappled all of his life. And that struggle, I believe, is love. Remember your mythology. Unget is Aphrodite, love. And her son, the god of the Gray Mountain, is Eros, also love. Remember that Psyche, whose name means soul, is the bride of the god of love, both love himself and the son of love. The human soul is married to love, who is the son of love. That sounds like something very much like something that I talk about just about every Sunday. So finally, let me return to autobiography and with some observations that may fill in some spots. Lewis's prose autobiographies, Early Prose Joy, Surprised by Joy, share two striking similarities. They follow hard upon the heels of the death of a parent, and they both come on the cusp of Lewis discovering great love. Albert, of course, dies in the fall of 1929, and that's one of the wonderful things about the redating. Lewis's conversion happens after the death of Albert. Lewis later comments, I feel very strongly, and I am not alone in this, that some good comes from the dead to the living in the months or weeks after the death. I think I was much helped by my father after his death, and I suggest that that help was the help to get Lewis to fundamentally convert, believe, and become a theist, believe in God. Once Lewis meets the God of love, he writes Early Prose Joy. And after he believes in Christ on the way to the zoo, he writes Pilgrim's Regress, which in itself contains, as I've mentioned, important bits of Early Prose Joy. Albert dies, Lewis converts, Lewis writes a spiritual autobiography. Minto, who Lewis, of course, referred to Mrs. Moore to as his mother, dies in 1951. Lewis is composing Surprised by Joy, right as she dies. Her death comes almost halfway through his writing of Surprised by Joy. And of course, parent dies, Lewis is writing an autobiography, and in 1952, Lewis meets Joy Davidman. And she who has already begun writing love sonnets to him. And it's Joy who types up the manuscript of Surprised by Joy. By the time the book is published, they are co-authoring Till We Have Faces. Lewis is falling in love with Joy by 1955. So a parental death, an autobiography, and the meeting of great love, the two great loves of Lewis's life, the love of God and the love of joy, happen at the end of a death and at the end of these autobiographies. After Lewis struggled to make sense of his life, love came in. The God of love in the early 30s, the love of joy in the early 50s. So let me conclude with Lewis's very loaded question, a question that his future wife actually typed up for him. But what, in conclusion, of joy? For that is what the story is mainly about. What of joy? Joy simply, ultimately, served Lewis as a signpost to love. Lewis writes eloquently about it in The Four Loves, published in the year of Joy's death. When two people who thus discover that they are on the same secret road are of different sexes, the friendship which arises between them will very easily may pass in the first half hour into erotic love. Indeed, unless they are physically repulsive to each other, or unless one or both already loves elsewhere, it is almost certain to do so, sooner or later. I believe and suggest to you that all of Lewis's varied autobiographies of every sort ultimately served as signposts toward a love that he could only find through joy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, thank you for that very insightful and provocative talk. That was really quite interesting. Very interesting, and I'm sure lots of people will have questions. Please do put them in the chat box below. If you are unable to do that, then feel free to put up your hand on your camera and I'll see you and call upon you, hopefully. Or if you don't want to do that, you can use reactions if you can work out how to do that. It might be nice while we have him here. I'm calling on him a little bit, so forgive me here, Michael. But seeing as your name was brought up a few times, it might be nice if we could just hear a couple of thoughts, Michael, that you might have on Andrew's presentation.
I think I've just unmuted myself. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Andrew, for that very interesting talk. I particularly like what you say about joy leading to love. I think that's insightful. And yes, Till We Have Faces is very much a companion piece to The Four Loves. In fact, this very week I'm teaching a group of students, getting them to compare and contrast those two volumes. What should I say? The question I was beginning to toy with before Daniel asked me to speak has to do with the question of autobiography. I'm going to throw a spoke in your wheel, a spanner in your wheel, whatever the phrase is, and quote to you what I'm sure you're already well aware of, the chapter on Satan in A Preface to Paradise Lost, where Lewis says, "To admire Satan is to give one's vote for ... a world of incessant autobiography." In other words, Satan is the grand egotist, the narcissist. He can't get beyond himself. How would you respond to that satanic interpretation of Lewis's own, apparently, allegedly incessant autobiography?
Thank you. Not much of a spanner, and I hope I have the works to process it. And I do acknowledge how much of a debt I owe to you and your friendship and your work over the years. I absolutely agree, and I don't find anything inconsonant with that. Of course, in Mere Christianity, Book 3, Chapter 8, the great sin is pride. And so fundamentally, I will suggest that the opposite of pride is not humility, but love. And the opposite of love is pride. And of course, pride is the complete anti-God state of mind. And so Satan, as the author, the great author of pride, is, Lewis, I think, is grappling with his pride all the way throughout. And in some ways, I think that he's working out this idea of the dethroning of himself, right? And so bowing the knee and praying and positing a thou is this dethroning of pride that happens. His autobiography, and he qualifies it in the preface to Surprised by Joy, I think it's purposeful. And I think that Lewis is even offering himself up as a story through which we can see what Frederick Buechner would call the magnificent defeat, where God comes in, as Joy Davidman would say. And so I think his attempts at autobiography are to get at joy, but then later I think Lewis tries to serve by doing autobiography in order to chronicle the kind of trajectory of his grappling with his own pride. And I think that he was, largely successful with his, his charitable humility, his willingness to serve. I think that Lewis is enough of a spiritual heavyweight that even he can take what he said in 42 and then turn it on its head, or let God use even the potential pride of autobiography to tell the story of joy that leads to love. And I think that that's maybe what he was about.
Yes, thank you. I suspect we just need to disambiguate two potential meanings of the word autobiography, if that's the right term, disambiguate. So satanic autobiography is self-reflective. It is narcissistic. It is writing about the self, very literally. But there is a charitable autobiography as well, which is, yes, in one sense about the self, but it is about the self as a means of escaping the self, or it is about the self as a means of reflecting God in one's own individuality. And after all, why have we been made individuals unless ourselves are of some ongoing importance and value?
Of course. And as we all know, Screwtape is being written at the same time as Preface to Paradise Lost, roughly speaking. And so what we have is an instance of Lewis using the devil's tools against the devil in order to help us to see clearly, see God clearly, see ourselves clearly, and see love clearly. His most effective work, I think, is when he flips the self upside down, so that in flipping it right side up, we can actually see that clearly. And so I think he's using Satan's tools against him. Or trying to, anyway.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The questions are beginning to flood in. So let me hand over to Daniel Friary.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew, for your talk. And it does in some ways feed off the last question that Michael just asked. I couldn't help thinking as you were going through your talk, there's so many parallels to Augustine. Obviously, the autobiographical impulse is somewhat there with the confessions, and even the answer you were giving before with thinking about pride and wrestling with these sorts of issues, but also the notion of joy as a sort of signpost, in the way that Augustine's theme in theology of finding these experiences acting as a signpost to the lasting joy, which is maintaining Christ. And even when you got to the end and started talking about the impact of the mother and his death and the deaths in the family, and then you've got Monica's death, and I just wondered, because of all of these links and the theme of charity as well, and the emphasis that you place on that, whether we have any record or evidence of Lewis's own autobiographical writings being influenced and shaped, having read Augustine and particularly the Confessions, and that sort of playing into his impulse and theology?
Wonderful question. Yes, if I could reach my desk, I would grab my copy of Surprised by Joy, where he says that he compares it, and I'm sure that there are others who can quote that much better than I. I think he was deeply influenced by Augustine and his model. But Michael, you know this better than I. What does he say about Augustine's Confessions there in the preface to Surprised by Joy? Shall I grab my book?
I don't have that in my memory. All I'm thinking of is the moment in the Four Loves chapter on charity where he ventures to disagree with Augustine. But before he does so, he says, I do so with fear and trembling because my own glad debts to Augustine are incalculable.
And, we know that Lewis kind of took everything in, and it served as this kind of active library for him. And all of these voices were, kind of continually speaking in his head. The book, he says, aims at telling the story of my conversion and is not a general autobiography, still less confessions like those of St. Augustine or Rousseau. But even in mentioning those names, he's certainly thinking of them and perhaps writing against it or writing at something of a slightly different species.
Thank you, Daniel, for that very interesting question. Anthony Buckley.
Many thanks, and many thanks, Andrew, for all you've given us tonight. I'm not as expert as everybody else here, so please forgive this question/observation. One of the lenses which I've always enjoyed reading Lewis through is his understanding of reality, and just sort of thinking of the Great Divorce and Weight of Glory and the end of Narnia, etc., and how his longing somehow ties into something which is truly real and what reality then means. And I found it really helpful what you said about the joy, the longing heading towards love. And I then caught myself thinking about St. Paul and love never fails. And I just wonder if real love, excuse the adjective, always has an element of reality in it that Lewis was looking for. So it's just pondering on that idea and just wondered what you might think.
It's just a marvelous question. And of course, love never fails. And followed shortly by seeing in a glass darkly. And mirrors play a significant role in Till We Have Faces and elsewhere. Yeah, I think that, well, if Jerry Root were here, he would say, no, it's not all about love. It's all about all reality being iconoclastic. And certainly there is that move that prevails throughout what Lewis says and does. The real, in Four Loves, he says, he refutes the statement, when the real gods come, the half gods go. And Lewis says, no, when the real gods come, the half gods can take their proper place. And so once love came, I think he understood what to do both with autobiography and also what to do with joy. This idea of iconoclasm, the thing that spurs Orwell to write her novel, is meeting this icon, this image of this idol of Psyche, and hearing that the story got about wrongly. And so she went to be an iconoclast. She went to set the story straight. And so there's certainly an element of that. And I think that the means that Lewis uses to get towards love very often is to help us to clear up our vision, which is part of why Lucy, the lucid one, is so important. Lewis wants us to see things clearly. And the thing he most wants us to see clearly is the love of God. So I think that it's exactly what you're saying, that he's using the reality of that love to define his story and to finally overcome Orwell's many protestations. So I could say more, so could Steve Beebe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony. And finally, I'd like to turn to Holly Ordway. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you, Andrew, for this talk. And so I actually wanted to do a little bit of further disambiguation. If we may go back to the beginning, you commented, you responded against the idea that Lewis hardly ever used first person and gave a whole bunch of different examples of first person. But as you do that, I noticed that nearly all of them in the fiction were narrative frames. So it's not till we get to Till We Have Faces that we have a really sustained first person narrator. And of course there's Screwtape, but there's a lot of frame characters in Out of the Silent Planet and so on. And so this struck me as possibly having some nuance for that autobiographical impulse, because you've got this I, but it's a self-effacing I that then hands over to somebody else to tell the story. And going back to what Michael was saying about the sort of charitable versus the satanic autobiographical impulse, it struck me that there might be a useful distinction between what he's doing with the frame I versus what he's doing with the full-on telling the story I. And so that arose out of what you were saying. So I was wondering if you might unpack that a little bit more or comment on that.
Yeah, it's a marvelous, marvelous and true observation. And he certainly is kind of handing off the narrative task as a frame, and of course, familiar with much, with many framed stories. And I think even his most full-throated first-person narrator is somebody who's not telling the truth from the beginning. And so I think that when Lewis says I, there's a very slippery thing happening. And the revelation in my thinking really kind of came from reading Planet Narnia about the secrecy. I think Lewis is kind of uncomfortable with his own story. And so, but he can't help himself from telling it. And so I think that there's even psychologically within him something quite interesting going on with all of that. And so, yeah, he's certainly kind of passing it off to a third person frame, but he kind of keeps his hand in the game as if he's struggling to find something out. And I think that ultimately, maybe his most sustained autobiography is A Grief Observed. But this doesn't happen until he has been so invaded by Joy Davidman that he can actually kind of speak without as much filter, and maybe suggest that Grief Observed is this ultimate fruition of him speaking kind of with his own voice. So I'm not sure if I quite got to what you were, and I welcome a follow-up if you want.
No, there was no particular thing I was getting to. It just struck me as interesting, an interesting point. And so I was just hoping to see you pick it up a little bit, which you have done.
Well, thank you very much. And please join me in thanking Andrew with a round of applause. You can see most of you there. So thank you so much, Andrew. That was really quite insightful, really very interesting. I'm sure it will, excuse me, I'm sure it will shape the way we read many of his books from now on, but especially Till We Have Faces. Sorry. So I'm very excited. This is our last meeting of the term. As you know, we've been doing it once every other week this term, just while we've been figuring out the Zoom thing and how we're going to operate within quarantine. But next term, we will return to once a week. And we will continue with the 7:30 time slot just while we're online. And the rest of the meetings will continue online for the rest of Trinity term. So all of those that are calling in from around the world will be permitted to continue to do so, which is very exciting. And if I can just whet your appetite a little bit for next term, we have some very exciting speakers lined up. We haven't quite formulated the term card. You'll get that during the holidays. But let me just give you a brief taste. We're very excited. We have Dr. Jason Lepayavi will be one of our speakers. Professor Simon Horobin. We'll be very excited to welcome Max McLean, who, for those of you that don't know, is the actor that portrays C.S. Lewis in Amazon's The Most Reluctant Convert, the stage show, and also the new film that's being created, which stars as well our very own Dr. Michael Ward.
With
very
hair.
Excited to, sorry?
With hair.
With hair. A majestic feat if ever there were one. very excited to welcome the Right Reverend, Right Honourable, the Lord Rowan Williams, who will be speaking, and Professor John Lennox will also be speaking next term. So very excited term, and of course, many more. We have 8 weeks chock-a-block full of excitement. So please do join us. If you haven't yet signed up to be on our mailing list, you can do so by either just quickly dropping a message in the chat now, or you can email our secretary, Grace Oliver, on grace.oliver@pmb, that's short for Pembroke, pmb.ox.ac.uk. That's grace.oliver@pmb.ox.ac.uk. So thank you very much for joining me. And we're looking forward to seeing you all next term. Have a wonderful vacation. God bless you all. Thank you.